Thanks to Marvin Getman of Getman's Virtual Book and Paper Fairs, and as well to Ioba for sponsoring this webinar. I'm Ed Lefkowitz. Today, I'm going to be guiding you through what you need to know to take clear, accurate photos of your books and ephemera. I'm going to cover 3 areas that will give you the tools to create the kinds of images you want, images that'll help your customers make the decision to buy from you. First, I'm going to talk about light. I'll talk about its qualities and how they apply to photographing books and ephemera, and most important, how you can control it to make better photos. Second, I'll look at the iPhone camera's capabilities and how we can tweak the camera to get the best images possible. Third, we'll go over what photographers refer to as post-production. That's everything that happens to an image between the time you take it and when you put it online. And while the title of this webinar is iPhone-centric, Android phones have similar functions, similar icons. So if you have an if you have an Android phone, you should be able to easily adapt this to your device. So take some notes. A little bit about me. I've been photographing for decades. I've been a full-time commercial photographer for about 15 years. And I photograph people mostly, but I also photograph products, including technically demanding products like these lipsticks for a cosmetic client. But I was a bookseller for over 25 years and specialized in rare books, manuscripts, and maps relating to ships in the sea, to exploration by sea, and to naval history and science. I started taking photos when I was a teenager, and when it was time to photograph books and manuscripts for my catalogs, I already understood how cameras worked and how light worked, so I had a head start on the process. Now, back then, I photographed for print catalogs, like this one, but these probably don't exist anymore. And initially, of course, I shot on film. This was shot on film. And then when digital cameras became available, I shot digitally. This is my first digital camera. It's a Kodak DC-260. You can look it up. They go back a long time. It's a heavy beast of a camera with a 1.8 megapixel sensor. By comparison, your iPhone has a 12 megapixel sensor. Well, now I want to get onto the subject at hand. I have to start by discussing light because it's central to photography. And if you're not getting the quality photos you need, light is probably central to the problem. There are 3 important qualities of light as they apply to photographing books. The first is intensity. So simply put, how bright is the light? Now you can see by these photos of a standard color calibration target that the light on each varies in intensity, and the colors and the brightness of each target are very, very different depending on how the light is hitting them or how much light is hitting them. The next quality is direction. And that's basically, or very simply, where's the light coming from? Now, you can always figure out light direction by looking at the shadows. The shadows will always fall away from the light source. And the third quality is color. Is the light warm, like candlelight? Is it white like sunlight? Is it bluish like open shade? Or is it something more complex? Now, the color patches in the target in each photo are identical standardized colors. But as you can see, we perceive and the camera records the colors differently depending on the color of light. So knowing how to control each of these 3 qualities, intensity, direction, and color, is really critical to your getting better images. So let's look at these qualities one at a time. First, intensity. Apart from the intensity of the light source itself, is it bright like the sun? Is it dim like a bulb? The further away the light is from the subject, the less light there is falling on the subject. Well, that's kind of obvious, right? But if you think that if you move the light twice as far away, you'll get half the light on your subject, you'll be very wrong. You'll actually get 1/4 the light. The inverse square law tells us that the light intensity varies with the inverse of the square of the distance. That's 1 divided by the square of the distance. So twice the distance, 1/4 the light. Forget the formula for now. Here's the geometric proof. As you can see by the diagram, the light covering a defined area at a given distance twice the distance. Now, one note that you have to keep track of is that the distance I'm talking about is the distance from the light to the subject, and it's independent of where the light is in relation to the camera. Next, I want to talk about light direction. The game of pool is a good visual analogy for how light works. If you hit a pool ball square to the bumper, it'll bounce directly back. If you change the angle at which you're hitting the bumper, the ball is going to rebound in a very predictable way. It'll bounce back at the same angle it hit. The angle of reflection, that is the angle of the bounce, that's angle R in the diagram, will be the same as the angle of incidence, the angle it hit. That's angle I in the diagram. Well, light works the same way, but you know that already, right? To see yourself in a mirror, you have to stand right in front of it. So if your light is coming from the camera position or very near it, and the surface you're photographing is at all reflective, here's the problem. Here's a paperback with a shiny cover coating that's lit from near the camera position. You can see the reflection of the light itself. So you're going to want to cure that. And how do you do it? You're going to use 2 lights. This will give you even coverage of the subject, put them at somewhere around a 45-degree angle from the subject, and then there's no direct reflection into the camera. A 2-light setup like this works for most books and ephemera. Well, here's another problem, or at least another challenge. This is a copy of Moby Dick with Barry Mosher's woodcut illustrations, and I wanted to show it open to a 2-page spread. Well, if I just open the book as I did here, the pages don't lie flat. So the lines of the type are curved, and it's not in uniform focus. If I put a sheet of glass over the spread, my glass is a bit smaller than the whole spread, but you get the idea. There's a good chance I'll see a reflection of the glass. But if I change the angle of the light, move it down maybe, move it off to the side a little more, there's no direct reflection. Now, if you look at the far right, you can see the reflection of the light on the table, but it's safely out of the cropped final image. So watch your reflections and keep adjusting the light. The takeaway here is to learn to see reflections, figure out where they're coming from. Here's the lower angle view of the book with the glass over it. I'll talk about the device I'm using to hold the camera and lights later. If I had a larger glass, a heavier glass, it would have held the pages flatter. Well, as you've probably gathered, I'm going to be talking about a number of problems you're likely to run into throughout the rest of this webinar. But fear not, I'll also tell you how to fix those problems. Here's another challenge. What if your book cover is an ornately tooled or a stamped binding, or an embossed binding like this one? If you light it evenly from both sides, as I did with the paperback in Moby Dick, you won't see the tooling or embossing because the light coming from the left side will fill in the shadows on the right and the other way around. Remember this slide when I spoke about shadows and light direction? If you want to show texture, shadows are your friend. And the solution here is to light it from one side or mostly from one side. To show texture, you need shadows. Got that? To show texture, you need shadows. You may have to play with your lighting to get what you need, so play with it. Now, this is a good point for me to mention light tints like this one. There are lots of variations, some with lights inside like this one, some translucent, which you're going to have to light with your own lights on the outside. They're designed to provide even lighting around three-dimensional objects. You can see the shadows around this pot are very, very soft. They do that well. They light 3D objects okay, but they're not great for photographing books and ephemera. Why not? Because these are not like most three-dimensional objects. They're basically flat. And when they have some three-dimensionality, as we've seen with the embossed binding, we want to have lighting with shadows to show off the three-dimensionality. So save your money, skip the light tint. Let's move on to the color of light. Light has color, and the color of light is going to affect your photos. If you go to your local big box store and look at the light bulb display, you'll see bulbs rated bright white to warm white and probably a range of hues in between. Each of the color swatches below 3 of these bulbs in the photos is identical in color to the other 2, but they don't look like the same colors, do they? Photographically speaking, light color is rated in degrees Kelvin, as if the light were caused by a filament as in old incandescent bulbs heated to a specific temperature. You may recall from your high school science class that unlike Celsius and Fahrenheit temperature scales, the Kelvin scale starts at absolute 0. So on that scale, daylight is about 5,600 degrees, warm light bulbs usually between 27 and 3,200 degrees, outdoor shade maybe 6,500 or 7,000 degrees Kelvin. Now, fluorescent light is different because it's not made by a heated filament, and it often has a green tinge to it, which is going to add another complication. And LED bulbs, the most popular bulbs out now, don't give off light from heated filaments either. So they can create complicated light as well. Their color tints are achieved by filters inside the LED. Now, cameras, including the one on your phone, are mostly set to auto white balance. They try to evaluate the light they record, and they adjust accordingly. Sometimes it works pretty well, sometimes not so well. Now, ideally, you should be able to set your camera to any lighting condition, and professional cameras can do that. The latest iPhone can do this as well. Excuse me. Earlier ones, well, hang on. Earlier phones like mine can't do it, at least not with the native photo app. Now, there are other more advanced smartphone camera apps, and they can usually achieve a specific white balance. I've linked to one of these camera apps in the notes. Now, many point-and-shoot cameras can also do a custom white balance, and they do that by taking a photo of a white piece of paper, recording that as a custom white balance and saying, yeah, the light we're looking at is this color, so let's take the rest of our photos with that assumption. Well, here's the book you saw previously, and it's photographed with auto white balance. The camera saw, it judged, and came up with this. But if you look, especially in the white text, you can see an orange tint, and that orange cast affects the entire image, not just the white. So here's the same book shot with custom white balance, and the colors are now accurate. The white is white, the blue is what it should be, and the reproduction of that print is what the actual print looks like. So if you can set a custom white balance, anything you photograph under the same lighting conditions will have the right white balance, and the colors will be reproduced identically. On a practical note, you'll usually want to light your wares with 2 identical light sources. You can use floor lamps, desk lamps, LED work lights, dedicated photo or video lights. IKEA has a couple of articulated arm desk lamps with weighted bases that are inexpensive. Now, these are sort of on the flimsy side, but they will get you started. There are other similar lights, some much better, with much better build quality, available on the market. Just take a look around. As long as you can move the lights about in relation to your subject, again, keeping in mind the reflections or the textures, and as long as they each produce light of the same intensity and color, you're going to be fine. So what you want is identical lights with identical bulbs. I want to move on to the iPhone camera. Now, the sensor in your phone, this is a photo of a general purpose sensor, not one in your phone necessarily, but the sensor in your phone looks like this. It has 12 million of these photosites. That's 12 megapixels, each of which records the amount and the color of light hitting it. The photosites look like this. Each one has a filter over it, red, green, or blue, so each site records only the intensity of that color at each site. Once it's recorded, your camera's computer puts it all together and creates the image for you. Now, to get a good image, the recorded light has to fall in a range that records details in the dark parts of the image, as well as details in the light parts of the image. If there's not enough light hitting the sensor, you'll get black with no detail. If there's too much light, you're going to get pure white, again with no detail. So the camera, which is really an engineering and computing marvel, does some math. You point, you click, it makes a quick adjustment, a quick computation, gives you a picture. The auto setting that the camera defaults to is fine for most purposes. It records details in the shadows and in the highlights, but it doesn't always work. Here's the problem with the auto setting. The camera's computer measures the light coming in and assumes, well, if assumes is a word I want to attribute to a computer, it assumes that it's recording an average scene. Maybe somebody having lunch at an outdoor cafe with a bright white label on the wine bottle, a kind of light tabletop, some dark foliage in the background, some bright colors, some dull colors. But in general, an average scene, right? Decades ago, Kodak calibrated its films and assumed that an average scene reflected back to the camera 18% of the light hitting it. Well, that assumption still holds in today's digital cameras, including the one in your phone. Their automatic mode is calibrated for this average 18% reflectance. The complication, and here we go with complications again, as it pertains to books and manuscripts, is that they often don't have average reflectance. So how do you deal with a manuscript on white paper, or with a mostly white dust jacket, or the opposite issue with a dark blue or a black binding? Well, you're in luck, because every camera, including your phones, has some kind of exposure compensation mode. I'm going to run a quick video to show you how this works on an iPhone, and I'll talk you through it. Oops. If you tap on it, you're going to see a sun symbol. If you slide the sun symbol up, the whole image is going to get lighter. If you slide it down, the image is going to get darker. Once you find that happy spot where you want it, take the picture, and you're done. Well, under most indoor lighting, whether including whatever light you're using to light your books, the camera is going to be using a slow shutter speed to expose the sensor's photosites for a longer time than it would in bright outdoor sunlight. And that will allow the sensor to record an appropriate amount of light. But the longer the shutter is open, the more likely you are to get a blurry image. We humans just can't hold cameras steady for very long, and camera shake will rear its ugly head in the form of blurry photos even before that second cup of coffee. So you're going to want some kind of camera support. Now, for books standing on a table or on a bookshelf, that would be a tripod. You're also going to need a clamp, kind of like this, to attach your phone to a tripod or other support. They're really inexpensive. They're available at your favorite online seller for like $10 or $12. Now, when you're buying a tripod, the standard advice is to get the sturdiest tripod you can afford. But there's a workaround for even flimsy tripods. Now, when you press the camera shutter, even if you try to squeeze it gently, a flimsy tripod will vibrate and the camera is going to shake. So what you do is you turn on the camera's self-timer. In iOS 16, you're going to see a clock symbol at the top of the screen. Click it and choose 10 seconds. Put the camera on your tripod, press the shutter, and step back for 10 seconds. Stay still after you step back. Don't shake the table, don't shake the floor, and don't jiggle the tripod. By that time, the tripod will have stopped vibrating. The timer will have taken the photos without further intervention on your part, and your part, and you'll have a clear image. For iOS 17, there are a couple of additional steps to get to the self-timer. Click the up arrow at the top of the screen. That arrow is going to change to a down arrow, and you'll see a row of symbols at the bottom of the screen. Swipe left on that row of symbols, and you're going to see the timer, just like the one you saw earlier. So click that, choose 10 seconds. Well, whatever version of iOS or Android you have, just look for the self-timer. Now, the other kind of camera support you're going to need is for when you're photographing something flat on a table, like a piece of ephemera or manuscript, maybe a framed print. There are a host of supports out there, and they range from overhead bars like this one, which are pretty expensive and heavy duty and fancy, to articulated arms like this, which was made by the Canvas company. I haven't tried any of the articulated arms. They're designed for smartphone video, and unlike still photography, with video, once you start the video going, the initial vibration is going to dampen very quickly. And you don't touch that, you don't touch the mount, so you don't have to worry about vibration. But because they have long arms and any vibration is going to be magnified by the length of the arm, most of these are likely to be shaky and hard to keep level for still photography. I haven't tried this one from Canvas, but they claim it's sturdy. I'll get back to these in a minute, but I suggest if you want to try one, avoid the cheap ones. Now, I use a copy stand made by Smith Victor. You can see my iPhone in a red case clamped on the movable mount on the vertical column. And the stand has clamp-on LED light panels on either side. It's really sturdy, and it may be overkill for many of you, but if you're going to do a lot of photography, it can be a worthwhile investment. You might find one used on Craigslist or eBay. I did. I want to get back to articulated arms like this one. And apart from the fact that they can vibrate, which again, we can work around with the self-timer, they've been designed for video. They have a ring light which surrounds the camera's lens and lights the subject evenly. But as I pointed out earlier, for your purposes, that may not be a good thing. You may want light coming from both sides or from one side, so you're going to have to turn the ring light off and use separate lights, as I mentioned earlier. Smith Victor, which sells this copy stand I use, also sells just the LED clamp-on light kit if you want to get that. Well, flat on a table or standing up, you want to keep the camera parallel to and centered on the subject so your book doesn't look skewed. The blue camera in the illustration is parallel to and centered on the gray book. If you're looking at it at an angle instead of square on, you're going to distort the subject the way a tall building tapers to a point when you look at it from the ground. Now you can see here that the top edge of the book is wider than the bottom because the camera is above the center of the book, kind of like this illustration. So for flat images or on a horizontal surface, you can use a level to make sure your camera is parallel to the plane of the subject. I like bullseye bubble levels like this one. They easily sit on the screen of a phone or a camera, but you have to test your level when you get it. Put it on a flat surface. It doesn't have to be a level surface, just flat, and note where the bubble rests. Turn it 90 degrees, and again and again. If it's accurate, the bubble will be in the same place with every turn. Now, I mentioned testing your levels because I bought a number of inexpensive levels. Many of these are designed to clip onto a camera's flash shoe, and they've all been out of whack in one direction or another, as you can see by the vials that have been blacked out. Now, again, keep in mind that the camera and subject don't each have to be level. They just have to be parallel. As long as they're out of level, the same amount in the same direction, you're okay. Well, before we start taking pictures, we'll need to confirm a camera setting. In the phone's setting app, go to Camera and Formats. Set the camera capture setting to most compatible. Well, at this point, you've controlled the camera in several ways. You've controlled the light intensity, the light direction, the light color, and the camera stability. So you probably have the beginning of a good image. So it's time to go on to the last part, post-production. But before we start editing, let me make something clear. The better your original image, that is, the closer you can get to accurate color rendition and exposure, the better off you are, and the editing will be easier. The mantra is, and photographers hear this all the time and they say it all the time, get it right in camera. Post-production is often referred to as photoshopping, but it's only that if you actually use Photoshop, which is a software made and licensed by Adobe, and it's available by subscription as a software as a service. So you can't buy it outright. You got to pay the fee every month. Do you need it? Not for your purposes. But you do need software, and you need it to do three things. You need it to get the exposure right. You need to get the colors reproduced as accurately as possible. You need to crop out distractions. There are basic programs you've got built into your operating system, whether it's Windows or Mac, and it's called Photos on both systems. They work similarly. If these apps aren't sufficient to do what you need, there are alternatives out there, and I'm including some links in the notes. But for today, I'm going to assume that many of you will want to edit on your phone, so I'll be using Snapseed. This is a photo editing app. It's made by Google, and it's available for iPhone and Android phones. It works really well. It's free on the Apple Store and Google Play. But whichever app you use, this or any other, just remember that the process of editing in whatever you're using is really the same. Well, as with the camera setting, we need to check some settings on Snapseed to get the output we want. So click on the three vertical dots in the upper right, and then click on Settings. Under the Export and Share options, make sure image sizing is set to 2000 pixels, and the output image quality is set to JPEG and 80%. This will ensure that the files you output are large enough to show detail, but not so large they'll take a long time to load. Now, once you have the image adjusted and cropped to your satisfaction, it's going to be larger, maybe much larger than you need, and too large to load quickly on a website. However many megapixels your camera has, and remember your iPhone has 12, you're going to need surprisingly few of them in the end. If you're putting images online, they'll be seen on a screen that's, in the case of my MacBook, for example, 2,880 pixels wide by 1,800 pixels high. If you multiply those numbers, you're going to get just over 5 megapixels. But you don't want to use an image that large. The human eye can only resolve so much. It really can't distinguish each pixel on a screen that size. So we've set the output in Snapseed to JPEG format, and JPEG files are compressed. All the information a camera sensor records is a lot of data, and we have to get rid of a lot of it. So here's what I mean. The raw data my working camera captures creates a file of unprocessed data that's 30 megabytes. That's the leftmost bar on the chart. But you can't see this image, right? It's just a file full of data. A TIFF file, TIFF, which includes the same information but in processed form so you can see an image, is 133 megabytes. That's the bar second from the left. Now, the third bar from the left shows the highest quality JPEG file of that same full image, 13 megabytes. Well, you can see, for one thing, that over 90% of the data of the full image has gone away, never to be found again. But if you decide on 2,000 pixels on the longest side, an uncompressed file is 344 kilobytes. That's the fourth bar from the left. That is a huge difference, a huge saving in space, and a huge ability to load much, much quicker. Well, for most practical purposes, all the data in the original image is not needed for the web. It would take ages to load, even if your web host allowed a file of that size. So your camera's computer or your computer software will resize it for you. That's why we changed Snapseed's output settings. Now, I'm going to take you through a video of the editing process in Snapseed. And I'm going to use a photo of a late 19th century American decorative binding. I'll take you through this and kind of narrate what's going on as it's happening. The first thing I'm going to do is fix the white balance, and that's going to sort out the colors. It's going to make the colors look more accurate. It's going to make the relationship between the different colors closer to what they really are in life. Like under a blue light, blue things are going to look brighter than red lights than red things will. The next thing we're going to do, now that we've fixed that color bit, we're going to rotate this and turn it right side up, just because we like to see things that way. Now, you can see at this point that the book is skewed, so we're going to fix the perspective. So we just click on perspective, and that's going to give you indicators at the corners, which you can just pull around and move the corners. You can move them up, down, sideways, till everything looks square. It'll superimpose a grid over it and just pull it to where you want it to be. And when you're happy with it, just click the check mark and go on to the next thing. And the next thing is we're going to crop it. We're going to get rid of everything outside the actual book. You'll see free on the left. Make sure you've checked free. This will allow you to drag each side separately right up to the edge of the book. Otherwise, it would be constrained to specific proportions, and you're going to leave something on the sides that you probably don't want there. Once that is done, again, hit the check mark. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to tune the image one step at a time. In Snapseed, brightness adjusts the overall exposure, right? You can slide it right to make it brighter, or left to make it darker. When it looks right, hit OK and go on to the next thing, which is contrast. Contrast controls the relationships between the lightest areas and the darkest areas. And again, sliders left and right. And then saturation, which controls how intense the colors are. Right is more intense, left is more toward gray. So when that looks about right, you can go on to ambience. Ambience is one of those weird things. It's basically controlling contrast in the midtones, so you can boost it a little to make the image pop a little more. After that, you go to highlights. You can make them brighter by sliding to the left, darker to the left, brighter to the right, darker to the left. And shadows, again, you can make the shadows brighter or darker by sliding. The last thing is warmth. Warmth, again, is kind of like the white balance. And because we've monkeyed with the image and we want to make sure the color is correct. When that's done, hit export, and you've created a copy with the permanent changes. It does all the magic. Yes, you're going to allow it to modify your image. And now you've got a saved image that's all correct and ready to rock and roll. So let me kind of reiterate. There's the final image, by the way. Let me reiterate the process. We're going to correct the light color, and that corrects the actual colors in whatever you're photographing. We're going to rotate and fix the perspective because we like to see things right side up. We're going to crop it. We're going to get rid of everything in the image that's outside the actual thing we're photographing, and so we can focus on what we really want to see. we're going to correct the exposure. We're going to make it brighter or darker as necessary. And we're going to fix the contrast, the difference between the whites, or rather the lights and the darks. Then we'll adjust the saturation, which is how bright the colors are. They're either more saturated, that is brighter, or they're less saturated, which is toward the gray. We're going to fix the highlights. The highlights are obviously the bright areas. We may want them brighter. We may want to tone them down a little and maybe get a little more detail in them. And again, we're going to adjust the shadows. We're going to either make them darker or make them lighter to bring out more detail in them. And finally, we're going to adjust the warmth, which again, basically corrects the light color a little bit further. And that's because everything that we do, especially correcting the exposure and the saturation and the highlights and shadows, is really going to affect how the colors are reproduced. And what we want to do is we want to get them as accurate as possible. So this is going to fix that and get it back to where you want it. So that's it. It's really very simple. Let me recap what we've done. We've learned how light works, right? We've learned about light intensity, light direction, light color. We've learned how it applies to our needs. We've learned the basics of how to set up your iPhone camera to get the images you need. And you've learned how to use the Snapseed app to edit and output files of enough quality and of the right size to really impress the hell out of your potential buyers. Well, thanks again to Marvin Getman's virtual book and paper fairs and to IOBA for sponsoring this webinar. And thanks to virtual producer Jake Van Ness of Elevated Virtual for making this webinar run smoothly. If you have questions, this is the time. What do we got, Jake?
So we got a couple questions. So the first one is from Susan. It says, are you saying the iPhone settings aren't as good as Snapseed's?
No, they're different. The iPhone settings are going to affect the image that you take. Snapseed is going to take that image and further refine it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
Okay. So the next one is, what is the best way to move the pictures from the phone to the computer?
It depends on what you're using on your computer for software. If you're using an iPhone and you want to use photos in iOS, your image manager app will help you do that, and it'll help you. In fact, it'll help you download the photos and put them pretty much anywhere you want. If you're using a Mac, you can also use AirDrop to move the photos to your Mac. If you're using Windows, you should be able to import. I'm not sure, quite frankly. I don't use Windows, so you may have to Google that one.
Okay, next one is, what is your recommendation for piece of glass for flattening books, type, thickness, etc.?
Yeah, I would look for a sheet of plate glass that's going to be big enough to cover whatever books you use, or maybe two pieces, a smallish one and a largish one. I mean, if you're photographing folios, that's going to require a big piece of glass. The best thing to do is just measure basically the largest book you've got, and use that as a guideline. Now, in terms of quality, window glass sometimes has bubbles in it, although that might work. Plate glass is kind of ideal because it's thicker and heavier. Um, yeah. It's, in terms of if you're concerned about like flaws in the glass or something, I wouldn't worry about that too much because by the time you get the image down to use online, whatever flaws or might be in the glass are really not going to affect the image as you see it. It's going to be so trivial it just won't count.
Okay, Paul, I've heard some booksellers talk about being able to purchase polarizing filters for iPhone. I don't have a good understanding of how that might help. What are your thoughts on the utility of polarizing filter for the kinds of photos you've discussed?
Yeah, it's a good question. Polarizing filters for product photography, you have to polarize the light, and then you put a second filter over the camera lens so that only light that's oriented in a certain light waves that are oriented in a given direction are allowed through. I've never needed them for either product or for or for certainly for books, never for photographing prints under glass, for example. I think my guess is that most polarizing filters for iPhones are designed basically for landscape because you can make skies darker without affecting the rest of the image. You can reduce reflections off of water, that kind of thing. Save your money.
All right, David, after you adjust in Snapseed, where are the edited pictures saved? In Snapseed or in the iPhone itself?
They're going to be saved in your iPhone Photos folder. So when you do that and save your when you export in Snapseed, open up your Photos folder. You're going to see two versions of your photo. You're going to see the original one that'll still be there, unchanged, and then you're going to see a separate image right next to it, the edited one.
Okay, Susan, where in this process do you give a JPEG number to the photo for uploading?
I'm not sure what you mean by a JPEG number. Do you mean a file? If you mean a file number, your your phone is going to assign a file number to every image. You can rename these if you want on your own. I'm trying to think of how you do that. I'm trying to think of whether you can do that on your phone or not. Let me take a quick look. Okay.
So, Susan, if you want to put in the Q&A,
Oh,
are you trying to add a number specifically for that book or whatever you're trying to shoot? Oh, okay. Or are you talking about the size of the photo, like the 80%? So let us know if you want to put another note in the questions, and I'm going to move on to the next one. Scott said, I noticed you had your aspect ratio on several photos set to square.
mhm.
Several photos set to square. Do you recommend that setting or does it depend on the item to photo?
No, it really depends on the item. I did that so you could see the rest of the iPhone screen for demo purposes. Um, for most things, you're probably going to want your regular photo setting rather than I guess I'm trying to remember what the options are. Yeah, you can do photo, you can do square, you can do pano, you can do portrait mode. And I would avoid portrait mode because that's going to look for faces. So your regular photo mode is probably the best one to use. And just ideally fill as much of the screen as you can with the image. The more you have to work with, the better off you are. You can always get rid of extra stuff later by cropping, but the bigger the better to start with.
Okay, so Steve has asked, would non-glare glass help in reducing reflections, or would it affect the image too much?
I think it affects the image too much. Non-glare glass is basically frosted, sometimes with a sort of semi-invisible frosting, but the clearer the glass you have, the better off you are, and just move the lights so you don't see the direct reflection. I go to museums quite a bit, and I'll often see things framed with glass, and the lights are arranged that in such a way that you see the light reflection in the glass, and that drives me nuts. You can pretty much light darn near anything if you just pay attention to the reflections, figure out where they're coming from, move the light.
Okay, David, in the iPhone edit screen, I see tools similar to Snapseed.
Mhm.
Why are they not sufficient?
They might be for you. I don't know. I happen to like the way the tools are arranged in Snapseed. I like the flow. I like the way it works. And I used it in this case in part because it's the same on both platforms, both Android and iPhone. But if your built-in editing app works, use that. And if there's something in it that you can't really do, try Snapseed. It's free.
Okay, Scott, if you take a 3D picture of a book at an angle from slightly
Mhm.
above, perspective means that the top of the book is wider at the top, closer to the lens, than the
Mhm.
bottom, further
Yep.
from the lens. That optically correct, but it looks wrong. How do you mitigate this with the iPhone? With a regular camera, I zoom in and put the camera as far back as possible.
Yeah. If you want, assuming that you want to show the top of the book, um, yeah, the further back you get, the further away you get, the less obvious that distortion is. The other option is, for example, in Snapseed, if you use the perspective control, you can drag the corners out and make the edges parallel or close to parallel. So try that.
Okay, so Susan came back and said in order to
Mhm.
upload a photo to a website, you have
Yep.
to connect it to a book inventory number. I wondered when or where you do this if you use Snapseed. Also, can you repeat what you said about iPhone settings versus Snapseed settings?
Okay. Your phone settings are going to control the photograph you take. It's going to, in the case of most compatible, it's going to put out a JPEG file instead of an HEIC file. You're going to be able to control the color to some extent, the exposure to some extent. It won't be a perfect image. I mean, I've got professional cameras that are really quite amazing. And I always run the images through software to fix something, to improve something, to make them better, more like what I have in mind. So your phone will get you a long way, but your photo editing app, whichever one it is going to take that image and it's going to put the finishing touches on it. It's going to correct the colors, the exposure, the perspective. It's going to crop it and all that. So I'm sorry, that's the second part of the question. What was the first part again? Oh, how do you connect? How do you connect them?
So I think what Susan's trying to figure out is, like, obviously she has to have specific numbers for the book inventory numbers. And
Right.
I will share that Shep, for like a couple comments down, did say that if you use like something like Dropbox, you can actually rename those files once they're in Dropbox. So that is a possibility. I think that's what she's trying to figure out, is like, how do you make sure that number is the correct
Right.
number for the book inventory number?
Got it. Yeah. So right, you want to right, you want to match up the inventory number with the file number of the photo. It's I don't know that you can do it in photos on your phone. You may be able to do it, rename the images in photos on your desktop. I'm not really sure because I never use it. But if you take that image file, put it in Dropbox, put it in any kind of folder, you can right click on it and rename it. So that's the easiest way to match it up.
Yeah, and Diane actually just shared as well. If you airdrop it and you put it on your computer, you can rename it like you're talking about right in the laptop.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So thank you
I know,
for that.
keeping track of assets is a whole other very complicated story. I mean, I've got hundreds of thousands of images that I have to keep track of, so I've got a pretty robust program that helps me do that. And like iPhone, or rather Photos, is not real great at image management. I mean, it's aimed mostly for people who want to take family pictures and vacation pictures and that sort of thing. But if you want to use it commercially, as we all are, basically, it's not such a robust means of doing it.
Curious if you'll understand this question from David. It says, how to set up floating images in Snapseed.
Floating images?
Yeah, so David, you might have to explain that a little bit more as to what do you mean by floating images? I'll give it a second for him to put that in. And that right now, that's our last question so far.
Okay.
But let's see if he puts something in as what he means by floating images.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, if anybody else has any last questions, please be sure to put them in the Q&A tab and we'll try to get to them. Oh, he says, it looks like the book is floating on the white background. So how do you deal with it looking like it's floating when it's on the white background?
Got it. Yep. So you want to photograph it on a bright white background to start with. You want to crop it so that there's some of the white background showing. And then you want to make that white background as bright as you possibly can. So if you use the highlight slider, this part gets complicated with a program like Snapseed or Photos, because there are real limits to what you can do. Because if you slide that brightness slider right and increase the brightness, the white part is going to get whiter, but so will the bright areas in the book. So you may need a more robust editing program for that, where you can just isolate that background from the book, and just brighten that rather than the whole image. Not a very satisfying answer in that, you know, I'm not convinced you can do it. You can get close to it probably, but you may need another editing app.
Yeah, there's some people sharing, like David shared, I use Paint Shop that has these features. Scott is saying FWIW, if I take photos with an iPhone, I edit images on my phone. Then I use Google Photos app to upload them to the cloud. Then he goes on his computer, logs into Google Photos. From there, downloads them from a PC and names them with the item number, and then uploads them to the web marketplace. So that could help Susan a bit with how to navigate getting that item number in there.
Right.
All right, so we are at the top of the hour.
Awesome.
I'll give it a 30 seconds. If there's any other questions, throw it into the question and answer. If not, I appreciate the presentation, Ed, and I think
Thanks,
we
Jake.
will end it here.
Okay, much appreciated. Thanks, everybody.